Hello, welcome, good morning, good evening, good night. I really wanted to make sure that I said that today because the last time we were together, I did not welcome people. And I didn't thank you for joining me on this journey. And I want to make sure that that gets out there because I'm eternally grateful to anybody who's listening to my words and sharing in this with me. I don't want my issues to become an excuse for rudeness, as my grandmother would say. Genuinely, thank you so much for joining me. And we have a lot to go through today. The last time you were here, I led off with the fact that things have gotten significantly worse. That is true. But there are glimmers in the dark. Now, I'm an eternal pessimist, so don't expect me to talk too much about that. There may be something that you can infer from what I'm about to share today. So the first question you may ask is, did I make it to Manchester? I did not. I'm still in Belfast. And that is going to be the bulk of what I go over today. Why didn't I make it there? And there's a lot to talk about. So when I got back here, I just immediately made a recording to keep everything fresh. And it's rough, it's difficult to listen to, but it's a very kind of clear account of what happened when I left Belfast and tried to travel away. And at the end of this, I hope you'll understand where I'm coming from, understand why I have not tried to leave again, why I am back here. It may be difficult to understand why I would be in a place which is obviously so hostile to me and obviously so dangerous. But I genuinely believe by the end of the recording you're about to listen to, you'll understand why. And I'm not trying to justify myself to anybody here. I've more than anything tried to justify it to myself. This is a really, really dangerous time. Everything is kind of balanced on a razor's edge. My mind, my body. So again, I want to say thank you for coming along with me on this journey. I appreciate it more than you know. So I'm going to hit play on this recording. Here we go. After several days of feeling crushed by the weight of all of this, living with the noises and the nightmares and the ghost, I called a very, very good friend of mine in Manchester and I asked her if I could stay for a while. I told her the truth to a point. I was feeling down. I was feeling alone. I really needed my friends. And she, bless her, she immediately just moved some things around, told me to book the flights. She rules. I could not wait to see her. I was so excited. I packed my bags immediately. And then Storm Lillian grounded flights. Storm Lillian it had been talked about for a while, but when it arrived, it was very, very, very strong. We're a very rainy island, and you can expect that there are going to be disturbances in the weather, but to ground flights, it takes a pretty hefty storm. And I knew it was going to be rough, but the wind and the rain were unreal. But I also knew that I couldn't wait. And I don't believe that the weather was anything to do with what's happened to me. Sometimes bad luck is bad fucking luck. There are people with very good reasons to get away from places who get screwed every single day. Not everything is a mystery, but it did feel at the time to me. It felt like another horrible coincidence, because even if it's not a mystery, it still feels like the universe is punching down on you specifically. It felt designed to leave me stranded, because ferries out of Belfast were not happening either. There was no way to cross. But ferries out of Dublin's port to Holyhead over in Wales, they were still taking place. So I jumped straight onto the website and just made sure that I got my tickets booked. And then straight from there, it was just to find out when the next train was. There was one more train, and there was no way I was going to miss it. I booked a taxi straight down to the station, and the relief I felt was unbelievable. Even if the empty streets gave way to empty seats on the train, I did not care. Just to be somewhere else and to be doing something active, and knowing that the next day I would be with my friend in Manchester, laughing, talking. I can't describe it. Just to be doing something to push myself forward that was positive. It felt so good. And I settled into my seat on the train with that in mind. And there was pretty much nobody else there. I was the only idiot traveling that night. But I was so comfortable, I put my bag away, settled myself in, and was just prepared for the journey ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd fallen between the cracks. There was nobody else on the train. And it was cold. Very, very cold. There was a draft which was just wafting through, and that feeling that you get where you just want a blanket and you want to, even though you're fully clothed, even though you're just sitting there, there's a chill that only just wrapping yourself up tightly can deal with. Even thinking about it sends a little shudder up my spine. And I was getting that, and as I was lying there, just in a kind of half-conscious drift, listening to the of the train as it rounded the rails and tilted gently, I realized that I was incredibly hungry. This was an hour into the 2-hour trip, and I'm normally very good at making sure that I take care of myself, making sure that I get fed. A lot of things had kind of fallen by the wayside, but I'd always kind of held on to making sure that I ate at specific times as, just something that made me human. My hygiene was falling apart. My sleep, God, you know enough about my sleep by now. But as long as I ate, when it was time to eat, everything was normal. Everything was fine. But in the rush that evening to get on the train and get away, I'd missed it. So I pulled myself up and just felt immediately lightheaded. Kind of like that low blood sugar, like unpleasantness. And kind of tried to just shoot my head and decided to make my way across the carriages to try and find a food cart. Maybe they weren't rolling it out because I was the only one on the train. Maybe the inspector was just sitting, not bothering. So I decided to head out and see if I could find them, just walk up the carriages. There weren't too many. And when I got there, I was hoping to just get, a bag of Skittles, a sandwich, maybe, just a glass of Coke to wash it down with. And so I stood myself up and started kind of like walking down the carriage. There was nobody else on the train, and the lights were kind of gently flickering in that weird way, like you're on a subway train, not an actual kind of like city to city train. I've never seen it do that before. I put it down to the storm outside, and through the windows I couldn't see anything. They were flat black screens like dead televisions. And that cold draft, it came tighter around my forehead. Just winding across my skin, and it's swampy, clammy, dragging down like my face, and in my gut, my stomach began to churn, there was no smell, there was no taste, but I began to gag like I'd been chewing on rotten meat. Even thinking about it now is really unpleasant, because it was like food poisoning. Not food poisoning at the start, but right in the middle. Oh, excuse me. When your stomach feels stretched out and it begins to cramp, and there's just this feeling just right down under your chest, just pressure and tightness. And it was horrible, and sweat was dripping into my eyes, my throat was tight, and those flickering lights, they seemed to flicker out for longer and longer and longer. And I just felt my way across the wall, my eyes were hazy at this point. I felt like I was about to just collapse. I felt so drained and so tired. I felt so just like a heavy sack of meat. I felt my way to the bathroom and pressed the button, and the door just kind of swung open slowly, and I fell inside. The door kind of shut automatically behind me, and I just kind of found my way to the toilet and just sat on it, just gripping the kind of the two handles they have on either side for, if somebody's in a wheelchair, they can use it to sit themselves down. I clutched them so tightly, and the room was spinning and spinning and spinning, and I felt like if I moved, I was just going to fall flat on the floor. There was just this wretched vertigo. I was so drained and I was so weak, and that's when the lights began to flicker to the point of almost becoming a kind of strobe, and then they went out. And the only lights in the room were these tiny little lights by the mirror. And I knew there was something coming. I didn't know what, but I knew it was outside, dragging its way toward me. And I heard it as soon as I felt that this was happening. I heard it. Of all the horrors I'd experienced so far, they've been cuts to my sanity. And there'd always been a sense that, as unknowable as they are and as terrifying their physicality is, there was an enormity to what dragged its way through the train. Thick, clunking footsteps like tree trunks beating on the metal and then scraping forward. A limping beat followed by that dragging scrape, and everyone sent vibrations through the windowless bathroom, making it feel smaller, making my teeth chatter. And that sense of vertigo just increased and increased and increased. I gripped the supports tighter as those steps beat like drums and then slowed. And there was a final scrape, and it came to a dead stop outside the door. there was an almost horse-like whinny, a smacking of lips that they do when they breathe out, followed by a ragged inhalation, just sucking air into many, many mouths. And then the door began to creak. And then it began to scratch at the door and paw at the door. And that whining sound that I kind of associated with a horse, it just became more and more high-pitched. Just... And then the words started. Babble nonsense words. And words I could make out as well. There's just languages I'd never heard, words that made no sense, all coming from 1,000 mouths, and so many of them I knew when my brain caught on them. It's the only way I can describe it. It was like when my brain tried to understand what was being said, it was like they hooked a piece of it and then it popped off. It was just, and I just couldn't grasp it, but I kept struggling to. They were old words. Old words. Older than dirt. And some of them not so old. I was sure I heard some Irish in there. There was no English. It was like a primal terror baked into my DNA, just right down. This was a thing that we as a species know. And have been very scared of for a very, very long time. The cramping in my stomach just spread like fire. I couldn't control my feet or my toes. My thighs were twitching like an electrical current was running through them. And it hurt. Every muscle hurt. I could make out a kind of rhythm to what these voices were saying. Like they weren't speaking a language that I could understand, but the intonation of the words was forming a kind of sick poetry that just scarred my mind. Like the absence of rationality and the absence of understanding was the point, and that in the gaps were the things that I could understand. Whatever was outside was monumental. The scratching at the doorway, the creak, it was just terrifying, but that pleading was almost pitiful. It was eager and agonized, and it dragged up a terrible empathy, like a fervent, almost instinctive desire to just fling open the door and let what was ever outside in. It felt like I was sucking down glass into my lungs every time I breathed, because every syllable it spoke was scraping across me. Not my brain, not my mind, across me, against the very essence of me, until I was just in the grip of a seizure. I remember starting to just shake. I remember just... And I also remember that it could have come in at any time. I remember that was what I was thinking, that there was nothing that could stop it from coming inside. There's nothing that door could do against its bulk, against its strength. But it needed me to let it in. It needed me to offer it my flesh and offer it my bones. I didn't fall unconscious so much as I just shut down. My mind was just incapable of registering what was happening anymore. I can still remember the words that weren't there, the words that weren't. I'm not going to say them. I can't say them. Even thinking about them just brings back that terrible hunger. But the sounds, the rocking of that room, the terror of it all, I remember that I just blacked out. It was the beep boop sound of the tannoy that made my eyes open up. I was still sitting in the corner, I'd lifted my head, my neck was aching. I'd been in such a slumped shape in an uncomfortable way. I'd not been thrown to the floor, thankfully, somehow. It felt like a night of hard drinking, like a complete blackout. The tannoy announced that we were rolling into O'Connell Street station, and it took so much will to open that door. I struggled, I really did. I went up to it and I did not want to touch it. I was just ragged with fear. But I had to. So I tapped the unlock button and the door kind of automatically started to roll open. And outside there was... I didn't expect there to be anything there. I didn't expect to see anything. But the floor and the walls were covered in mud. And I mean, not wet mud. I mean that thick mud which is picked up and then carried for some time and clings to something and then falls away. If you've ever clapped boots together after a hike or playing a sport like rugby or football and the mud falls off, it's like that. And it had the same scent as well, that kind of heavy locker room sweat smell. And the door behind me closed. I could see the scratches on it and the patches of dirt and mud and a wetness. I did not hang around. I went to get my bag, and in that lightly shuddering carriage hallway, as we rolled up to the station, I felt emptied out, gaunt, feeble, and so hungry. I couldn't eat. I wanted to, but I had no appetite. The station was normally heaving with activity at all hours, but it was so quiet that night, much like the train, much like Belfast city centre. And I just went outside, found myself a taxi, jumped straight in and just asked him to take me to the port. I lay in the back, just completely ragged, and my driver could not shut the fuck up about the storm. I wanted some quiet and I wanted some peace. I needed a moment to rationalize what had happened on the train, but I didn't get it. And it's impossible not to engage with an Irish taxi driver when they're in full flow. He wanted to talk about the storm, which led to how he and his wife saw a terrible one out in Tenerife last year. But they'll be back. But his sister won't be with them because of what she did. I asked what she did, and he told me it'd be wrong for him to say. And it locked me into a mystery as equal to the one that I was neck deep in and equally impenetrable, you know? I still can't quite get over the whiplash of encountering whatever I encountered on the train. And I have some theories there. But I can't get over the feeling of complete dread followed by a kind of full pattern nonsense of a Dublin taxi driver. It's an incredible juxtaposition, you know. And I'll say this: he was a good guy, and his raw normality grounded me as well. It pulled me back. It didn't lessen how I was feeling, but it put a pretty stark border in that car between the life I'd been leading and that of everyone around me. You know, the people that I wasn't seeing, like the normal people. And he chatted majority of the way there. It wasn't a long journey, but they were removing people from the ferry when I arrived and putting up signage closing the port. Storm Lillian was saying no. And I was grabbing my bags from the boot and working my way around to the driver and said, look, I've not paid, but can you take me, I've not paid yet, so can you take me back to town? And so I can find myself a taxi and, grab a takeaway and be back in the morning. Because the rain was coming down, it was just coming down heavy wave now. It was brutal, just smashing against the roof of the car. He said that was fine, so I hopped in. And, he turned and just asked me exactly where I wanted to go. And through the window and the water on the window, I saw them. And I've become accustomed to how they look now. Their gaunt faces, their glassy eyes, their kind of restrained mania making them shake and shiver. But I'd never seen them together in a group, in a flock, in a murder of stalkers. There were 5 of them, including the woman from Chris's Google Drive, who I'd seen in Belfast when I was on the bus. And they just left the port and they were standing in the lashing rain. And because I'd never seen them together, this is not something that I'd ever seen before. Our eyes can pick up on symmetry, on uniformity, and it can freak us out when patterns shouldn't be. And they were heaving the same breath with a hideous regularity. The way they kind of raised up and dropped and raised up and dropped together, it was unnatural, just completely wrong in such a mundane way. They were like the world's smallest crowd packed in close, just rammed in tight, like someone was pressing them together. And one of them looked oddly familiar as well. It wasn't the woman from Chris's Google Drive. This was like a young lad. He had the same sallow face, the skin pulled tight to the skull, eyes wider than they should be. And he seemed a little more alert as well. And the driver drove on. And I leaned back, looking through the rain-slit window, and I watched them turn toward the taxi, all as one. And I watched them turn the other way. They were there for me. And they had somehow got there before me. And as horrifying as that realization is, as worrying as it was also oddly calming. Because there's no magic to this. There's no crazy mystery. I'd made a booking the day before. They must have had some way to access my desktop or my phone. That made sense. That was something that I could figure out. I saw them in a place where they shouldn't be, where I'd made plans to go, so they had access to my plans, which also then answered, how would they know about Chris's Google Drive? That answered another mystery. So for a second, I was just bouncing between things where it didn't lessen the panic. I can't actually kind of like oversell how scared I was to see them. I mean, it may sound here like it sounds more like an oddity, especially in the follow-up from that experience on the train. And I'm treating this as a triumph, but this is a guess, but it was more down to earth, and it was important information that I didn't have. And you know, when I caught a glimpse of them, part of me was back on Cave Hill running for my life, and it took so much not to shout to the driver to slam down on the accelerator. So much kind of like to, but let's be honest, it wasn't like a will or a force or anything. It was fear. It was fear that made me not yell for the driver to drive away quicker, because I'll be completely honest with you, I didn't shout because I was afraid that they would hear me. But that was something, right? They were there because of something. There was a logical thread, a logical reason that they got there. That was something I could work with. So rather than go into town, I asked the driver to find a hotel for me. I didn't want to use my phone. I asked the driver to look up a random hotel in Howth, which is just north of Dublin City by the coast. And I said, like, you know, if they had desktop access, you know, then they would know. If they had access to my phone, they'd be able to see what I was doing. So why risk it? And the taximan didn't even question it. He just instantly told me there was a lovely place called the Marina Hotel. It was a bit pricey, but he'd been there for a wedding, wife, sister again. You know, and apart from a freshly crowned husband being a bit of a dose, you know, he'd been impressed with the place. And they'd had a room, they'd stayed there, and he told me that it was perfect, and he wouldn't mind just taking me up there. And I asked him if we could stop at McDonald's. He said, absolutely fine. You know, I just had the perfect taxi experience. This guy, if I could say his name here, I would recommend everybody get him. He was just a cool dude. Just thinking about the normality of that guy, just honestly, an absolute tonic to everything else. But we stopped at McDonald's drive-through, empty-ass calories, yeah, but sometimes you just need a Big Mac and you need all the extras. It's pure comfort food, and I needed some form of comfort that night. So I still hadn't had a chance to rest. I still had a chance to find any kind of peace. And he wound his way down to the Marina Hotel, which was nestled above a bay that was all crashing waves and thunder up high. You know, ozone and salt when I got out of the taxi. And I waved the fella goodbye. He was like, I mean, I paid him a lot. Like, he earned his keep, like, let me say. But, you know, I was kind of, I never thought I would ever say this, but I was sorry to see him go, because he was just kind of keeping my feet on the ground at that point. He didn't know it, and he never will. But he pretty much saved me that night. He saved me from making a lot of stupid mistakes. I walked into the hotel and they weren't eager to see me at all. You know, it seemed like they'd assumed no one was turning up because of the storm, and I get it. I've worked quiet shifts like that myself, where being given any work to do is like an ambush. So they boot me in fast, and I told them that I'd be fine finding the room. Just as the taxi driver had said, it was a nice hotel. It was outdated, but not in a tacky way. You know, heavy red carpets on the floors, light wood paneling on the walls, and the hallways were heaving with hair freshener. You know, people were taking care of this place. And my room itself, like number 83, it was a bit granny-esque, you know, too many tacky flowers on the bedding, cream walls, lacking in personality, but honestly, that's just my wild-ass brain honing in on decor. It's my one weird gay thing. You know, a friend said to me once, it doesn't matter how masculine or feminine you are, there's always like one weirdly specific gay attribute you have. And I said to him, that's ridiculous. That's absolutely stupid. But honestly, it doesn't matter the situation I'm in. I'm always going to evaluate a hotel room by an internal granny score. And this place was a solid 5. It felt amazing to just sit in the garbage chair that was too small for me, messing around with a cheap flat screen, fail to get it working, and then wolf down a Big Mac, cold fries, and a pair of cheeseburgers. It was gross and perfect. Because there's a relaxation that you get from settling into a room that isn't your own, a peace and ease that can't last long term. But that first night, when you get in there after a long, stressful journey, and I don't think I've ever had a journey as stressful as this one, there's nothing quite like it. And there wasn't long at all before I just fell into bed. I was out like a light as soon as my head hit that pillow. You know, my sleeping pattern had been so broken from trying to rest between dawn and dusk. And apart from snatched minutes and that missing time on the train, I'd been awake for almost 24 hours at this point. So it was very surprising to me that I woke up long before sunrise. It was the scratching that woke me up. But what struck me first when I opened my eyes was the absence of any kind of dreams and the absence of that heavy presence in the room. They become so familiar. And my breathing was very disrupted. I talked before about having panic attacks. I'd been having difficulty kind of finding my rhythm as I breathe. And I was just in an incredibly panicked state. But outside of that, my head just felt unburdened. I had no fuzziness. I wasn't tired. It was just a straight from waking clarity. But all I could hear was that scritch, scritch, scritch over on the door. And I lay completely stock still. And I forced that breathing into short, shallow breaths. I kind of knew that I could not control them, but I was kind of just being like, okay, let's be easy, your head's clear. It was the strangest thing because I had this fight or flight response. But I was also in a complete state of clarity. It was the strangest kind of thing. And outside, the storm was so heavy. I tried flicking the side lamp on and it just refused to brighten up the room. I don't mean it refused to come on. It's like every time I flicked the light and tried to fiddle with it to see if it was dimmed, it was like the light from the lamp was being eaten as it came out. And I lay back and I sunk deeper into the bed because this was something, much like on the train, this was something different. I felt exposed in a way that I hadn't felt for weeks. When this began, I'd started to notice the patterns. I'd never become comfortable with what was happening in my home in Belfast, and I was never comfortable with the events of Cave Hill, but there was an understanding there. I'd come to understand what was happening. There was a bizarre logic to it. And this was something else. And over at the door, the scratching intensified. It got louder and more urgent. My first thought was, it's the thing from the train, it's back. And I knew that it wasn't, because the immensity of that creature was very different. I talk a lot about presences, and the presence was something else. This was nothing. It was just scratching and scratching, and the quicker it got, the tighter I gripped the duvet with one hand. And in this room, where I was completely alone, my other hand was gripped by somebody else. And wrinkled fingers just interlaced with mine, and I could feel nails digging into my palm. I pushed off the bed so hard and just rolled onto the floor, just taking the duvet covers with me. I stumbled straight into the wall. There was somebody there. There was a shape on the other side of the bed, and I could only see them through flashes of lightning that came through the window. It was a wretched, wretched woman. She was just... God, she was just like frail. Her legs kind of twisted, either from something at birth or some kind of accident. She had a toothless mouth, and her greyed hair was just loose all over her face. It was kind of wet and just cast over her face. Her hands were like tweaking, with milky white eyes that were just staring at me from the corner of crusted eyelids. And she was completely immobile, but for a porcine trotter-like hand, those 5 fat fingers with nails that went too far up. And I could still feel where that rancid flesh had touched me. It stung like nettles. And then she just wheezed out the gentlest of squeals through her gummy lips, and it sounded like a laugh. I was gone. I rushed for the door, completely heedless of the scratching outside it. There was just something so wrong about that woman, and I grabbed the handle and it refused to move. I slammed into it. I grabbed it behind. I could hear the bed creaking. She was rocking from side to side. I fumbled with the lock. It just wouldn't turn. And behind me, I just heard a heavy thump on the floor and a low whine. And she was crawling in the dark behind me. And I slammed into the door and it didn't budge. I slammed into it with my shoulder. I kicked it. And then I stared through the peephole, and I was staring back. Behind me was the old woman. She was screaming into my ear, and I was the one scratching the door, and my nails were bloody and they were torn. Every time I dragged my hands against the wooden door, that just more of them were being ripped out. And she screamed and she screamed, and I could hear her clambering behind me, and I knew that if she reached me, then what I was looking at was what would be. So, for the second time that night, I hurled myself into a bathroom. It fell open and I slammed it shut. I grabbed the light cord again and again and again until it ripped out of the ceiling and the light never came on. And just like on the train, the door began to rattle. These things have terrible patterns. It began to rattle from the bottom at first. And then it rattled in the middle. And then it started to beat like a drum. I knew that I was locked in this small space. There were no rules, like the thing on the train that needed me to accept it. What was going on outside the door? It was brutality. It was chaos, bedlam, just fucking mayhem. That's when I started to breathe. Fuck me. So I started to find my breaths. Just like when I was in the bath that first time, I started to take deep breaths in through the nose and out through the mouth, and I felt the calm, and the door was still banging, and the scratching was still scratching, and she was still whining. And I knew the door was gonna fling open soon. But that calm was not the calm of meditation. It was more like an alignment. I saw the tree. I saw it so clear against my closed eyes, branches high, its shape stark against the dawn. And there were people there this time. I couldn't see them, but I knew that they were behind me. The hammering on the bathroom door, it stopped. For a second, I thought it was because it was open, and this was my death. This was the end. But that adrenaline that was in me just fell away and was replaced by just have I described this before? Just that marrow deep terror, just primal. And do you know what the worst thing about it was, more than anything else? Fuck me. For the first time, I knew what my mother meant when she told me that I would understand when I was older. Because that terror comforted me. And I didn't just understand what she was trying to tell me. I knew it. I knew it. It's better the devil you know. Better that than all the twists of possibility of what's out there. That it's better to deal with what is rather than what could be. And tears were running down my face, and it wasn't relief. I was about as far from relief as you could be, because the soles of my feet were bare, and I should have felt cool tiles, the bathroom floor. But instead they were kind of pressed into sharp, unkempt overgrowth. I could feel an outdoor wind caressing my skin. and I opened my eyes to look upon the forest from my dreams. I was walking forward. That nightmare smell of the stalkers, not just heavy on the air, it was the air. And beneath this canopy in the forest in the half-light, it was impossible to tell whether it was night or day. And my legs were tight, but they weren't my legs. I wasn't controlling them as I just marched through these trees. It was cautious but quick. And staring through the leaves with eyes that were just far keener than mine had ever been. I could see my hand motioning to others around me. And in the gloom, shapes were approaching quickly. There were words, again, for the second time that night, words, ancient words that I had no hope of understanding. And then there was flight. Just flight through the trees. There's screams and shouts from behind. The leaves are whipping against the face that isn't my face. There's no control, but I can feel every single muscle, every twinge of pain. They're close, those pursuers, and if they catch me, if they catch us, we're dead. We are just done. I know that's why we're running. I know that there's a greater purpose for us being there. I can't quite grasp it, but I know that we have to run. I know it so deeply, and I know that I'm here in this body that isn't my body and a mind that isn't my mind, but I can feel all the motivations. I can feel the direction it's moving in, even if I can't fathom any of the thoughts, because those thoughts hurt. They're carnivorous, cannibalistic. Every second I was there, I felt myself being consumed, devoured, gnawed away, dissolved and dissipated, like somebody had taken to my soul, and I was running faster, or they were running faster, or she or he. We were running faster and faster and harder, and then there was a door. It was a hotel door, room number 83. We hit that door, did not slow down. The wood hit my head like somebody had swung it like a fucking bat, a belt sander. My legs gave out, and then I'm on the carpeted floor in my hotel room. I'm half naked, wet with sweat and shivering. There's mud on my feet. And bizarrely, I could still feel myself running forward, like a part of me was still riding that mind, fleeing through the woods. I felt sick. I felt as dizzy as I had in the train bathroom earlier. The old woman was gone. The lights were flickering. The storm was raging outside. And at the apex of every breath I took, I felt those leaves that had wept against my cheek, and the beat of feet still against wild earth. And just a rising alien panic. And I spent that night pacing the lobby, and I messaged my friend, letting her know that the storm had delayed my plans, and I decided not to travel at all. I didn't care right there or then if the stalkers were able to see my messages. I had to go back to my house. It wasn't a home anymore. It was just a house. But I had to go back. I learned my lesson. I couldn't leave. I mean, somehow I'd just been unmoored from normality, from reality, and set adrift on deep, angry seas. And the things I'd seen that night were real. They were physical. They were not dangerous, because dangerous doesn't do them justice. Danger's mortal. It's something that can be measured. These were things from between the cracks in the perception of this fucking world, and you could see them too if you were unfortunate to be in the wrong bed at the wrong time, or in the wrong state of mind on the wrong rail line, because they want you and they want me. It's just that the world has become hostile to me as a result of all of this. People don't come near me. I talked about this sense of alienation, and it's like Chris said and described in those posts that I read. As his world began to fracture, they become wide enough for things to come through. Back in Belfast, though, I'm secure. I've got protection. I hate saying it like this, but I hate it. I hate it. But I'm secure because I have protection. I'm not at mercy of the things that lurk in the dark like you are. Even though I'm giving my terror to something else, every sob just a fucking prayer to this malevolent fucker who's doting upon me, wants to harvest my screams. I'm at my lowest right now. I'm struggling, but I can't let go of hope. I can't. Before I headed back here, I contacted admin on a computer at a library to talk about how the stalkers could access my information. InfoSec is her day job, and she was freaked out for me and ruled out phishing or any kind of like 90s magic hacking. That no kids in a room like banging things out. The easiest way for them to do this would just be to mirror my screen. And to do that, they just need access to my PC. They need to be in my house. And I wasn't even afraid of that. That didn't... I just said, oh, when I saw that, I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. It's crazy that I could read that and not feel any sense of like concern. And we both ruled out my phone having any role in this, but I've spent what feels like an eternity changing passwords and adding two-factor authentication alongside a VPN. And that's the true horror here. Organizing internet security for like a fucking million accounts. You know, there are some things that they don't know that I now know. And so I'm delaying releases of this because it's important for me to keep sharing. In case anything happens to me, I want this out there for people to know. And because if they want to fuck with me, I'm going to fuck with them. And this gives me some small amount of power. Admin has given me so much to work with here, and when my DNA results come in, and they will be in very soon, it's Christmas for her. And this isn't Agatha Christie, this isn't a cozy case with a logical solution, but every single encounter that I've had has given a little glimmer, and what we found paints a clearer picture of what we're dealing with. And I know now that it wants me to align. It wants me to let it in, much like that thing on the train. It wants to force its way in. It wants to take control of me like it's taking control of Chris, like it's taking control of however many other people. But to do that, I have to be in alignment with it. My breathing, I have to follow those same rhythms. And as long as I keep that in mind, I can resist this.